It was just after dusk on October 9th, 1975, when the last trace of Linda Rayburn slipped quietly out of Twin Falls, Idaho. The sun had long disappeared behind the Snake River Canyon, leaving the town bathed in that faint golden-gray light that made everything look like a memory. Linda, 21, was driving home from her shift at a small diner off Blue Lakes Boulevard, humming along to Fleetwood Mac on the car radio. She had no way of knowing that within hours, her name would become one of the most haunting in Idaho's unsolved history. Linda was the kind of person people didn't forget. Friends described her as soft-spoken but unshakably kind, a young woman who could calm arguments with a smile and make strangers feel seen. She'd grown up in Jerome, just 15 miles north of Twin Falls, the eldest of 3 siblings in a modest brick home surrounded by open fields. Her father, Carl, worked irrigation maintenance for local farms. Her mother, Mabel, taught Sunday school. In a town where everyone seemed to know everyone, Linda stood out not because she wanted to, but because people naturally gravitated toward her. In 1975, life in Twin Falls moved at a slower rhythm. The economy was built on agriculture and small-town industry. The community was tight-knit, the kind where news traveled faster than the mail. Teenagers gathered at drive-ins and football games. Families locked their doors only out of habit, not fear. But all of that changed the night Linda didn't come home. She was last seen leaving Miller's Diner at 9:47 p.m. Her co-worker, Nancy Pierce, remembered waving as Linda walked toward her old blue '68 Chevy Nova parked behind the building. The evening was cold, and the streets were empty except for a few late-night delivery trucks. When Linda didn't arrive home by 10:30, her mother assumed she'd stopped for gas or caught up with friends. By midnight, she was pacing the kitchen, the sound of the wall clock echoing through the quiet house. By morning, worry had turned to fear. Her car wasn't in the driveway, and the phone remained silent. Carl drove through town, checking every gas station and roadside turnout. When he called the police around 8 a.m., they began what they first assumed was a missing persons search. A young woman late getting home, maybe run off with someone. But Linda wasn't the kind to leave without a word. Officers from the Twin Falls County Sheriff's Office began canvassing the area that afternoon. They found her car 2 miles outside town, abandoned on a dirt turnout along Shoshone Falls Road. The driver's door was locked. The keys were gone. Inside were her work uniform, a half-eaten sandwich, and her purse, untouched. Her coat was still on the back seat, suggesting she hadn't planned to get out for long. The first real clue came from a trucker who had driven through the area between 10 and 10:30 that night. He told investigators he'd seen a dark-colored pickup parked behind Linda's Chevy, its headlights off. He thought it was strange but didn't stop. The man behind the wheel, he recalled, was tall, wearing what looked like a brown jacket. In 1975, that description could have fit half the men in southern Idaho. For days, volunteers searched every inch of farmland and riverbank near the canyon. Helicopters circled overhead. The community held candlelight vigils outside the diner where Linda had last worked. Flyers with her photograph, a black and white snapshot of her smiling in a floral dress, were posted on telephone poles and grocery windows. But weeks passed, and the leads dried up. No footprints, no signs of struggle, no clear suspect. The case file began to fill with rumors and dead ends. A transient worker spotted near the highway, a reported scream by a camper at Dirkus Lake, a piece of fabric found near the cliffs that turned out to be nothing. By November, the official search was scaled back. Winter was settling in, and so was a heavy silence. The Rayburn family refused to give up. Carl spent every weekend driving through rural Idaho, stopping at rest areas and motels, asking if anyone had seen a girl who looked like his daughter. Mabel kept Linda's room exactly as it was, the bed neatly made, her favorite books stacked by the nightstand. On Christmas Eve, Mabel lit a candle by the window and told her younger children, She'll find her way home. But she never did. By early 1976, the investigation hit a dead end. With no body and no evidence of foul play, the case was reclassified from missing person to presumed foul play. Linda's name was entered into the state's unsolved files. Time moved forward, but the hole she left behind did not. For the Rayburns, life became divided into before and after that night. Every year on October 9th, they gathered at the canyon overlook, laying flowers near the guardrail and whispering prayers into the wind. And every year they left with fewer answers than before. What no one knew, not then, not for decades, was that somewhere in the dusty archives of the Twin Falls County Evidence Room, sealed inside a small manila envelope, lay a single piece of evidence that would one day break the silence wide open. By early 1976, the investigation into Linda Rayburn's disappearance had consumed nearly every detective in Twin Falls County. For a while it was all anyone could talk about. Her missing car, the mystery pickup truck, the fear that something sinister had happened in a town that had never seen such darkness. But after months with no answers, the headlines grew shorter. The phone calls stopped. Life reluctantly began to move on. Detective Harold Decker, the lead investigator, kept the case file on his desk long after others had cleared theirs. Decker was a 20-year veteran, the kind of man who believed every mystery could be solved if you just worked hard enough. But Linda's case tested that belief. The evidence was painfully thin. There were no fingerprints on the Chevy Nova that didn't belong to her family or co-workers. Tire impressions from the scene were incomplete, and the soil too loose to hold a clear pattern. The witness accounts varied. Some thought the pickup was blue, others black or brown. Even the timing of when it was last seen differed by an hour or more. Still, Decker persisted. He chased every rumor that came through the station. A suspicious drifter, a man fired from a nearby ranch, even a report from a teenage boy who claimed he'd seen a woman matching Linda's description near the Boise Greyhound station. Each lead led nowhere. By spring, frustration was giving way to resignation. The sheriff's office had limited resources, and new cases kept piling in. "We can't chase ghosts forever," one deputy told him. But Decker couldn't let it go. He'd drive out to Shoshone Falls Road every few weeks, parking by the turnout where her car was found. The same canyon winds would whip through the grass, carrying the scent of sage and river water. He'd stand there staring at the open land, wondering how someone could vanish without leaving a trace. When the first thaw came that March, search teams scoured the canyon again, this time focusing on remote access points near the water. Divers were brought in, probing the river bottom where the current was strongest, but the Snake River had a way of keeping its secrets. Nothing surfaced. In July, Decker filed his final progress report. The document was just 3 pages long. The last line read, "Investigation ongoing, no further leads at this time." He tucked it into the manila case file, sealed it and placed it in the evidence room, unaware that it would stay there for nearly half a century. The years that followed were not kind to the Rayburn family. Carl grew quieter, worn down by years of unanswered questions. Mabel threw herself into her church, clinging to faith where logic had failed her. Their 2 younger children, Danny and Marlene, grew up in the shadow of a sister who was everywhere and nowhere, her photograph on the mantel, her laughter replayed in old cassette tapes, her memory frozen in youth while they grew older. By the early 1980s, the town had changed. New stores opened, new families moved in. The older generation still remembered Linda. They'd point to the canyon overlook and tell visitors, "That's where that poor girl went missing." But to most newcomers, she was just a name whispered at the edges of local lore. In 1984, the Rayburns held a small memorial service at their church. Without a body, there was no burial, just a framed photograph surrounded by white lilies. The service drew dozens, friends, teachers, former co-workers, all united by the quiet ache of not knowing. When the pastor read her name aloud, Mabel wept silently, clutching her husband's hand. After that day, the family stopped talking much about the case. It was too painful, too heavy. Life had to continue, even if it was smaller, quieter. Detective Decker retired in 1988. Before leaving, he packed up his desk and walked one last time into the evidence room. He paused in front of the old cold case shelf, running his hand over the dusty label that read Rayburn Linda, 1975. For a long moment, he stood there in silence. Then he whispered, "I'm sorry, kid," and turned out the light. Through the 1990s and 2000s, the case remained frozen in time. The physical evidence, Linda's clothing, purse, and a few collected swabs, were sealed and catalogued under the county's preservation program. So over the years, the packaging yellowed, the handwriting faded. No one expected it to matter anymore. But then, in 2017, something changed. The Twin Falls County Sheriff's Office announced the creation of a cold case task force, a small team of retired detectives and forensic specialists brought back to re-examine old cases with new technology. Among the boxes pulled from storage that spring was one labeled Rayburn 1975. Inside were the same items Decker had stored decades earlier, including a scrap of fabric from Linda's car seat and a small plastic vial containing a few faint stains collected from the driver's side door handle. Back then, it had been impossible to analyze. But now, with modern DNA testing, even degraded samples could hold secrets. When forensic analyst Dr. Kate Morrell unsealed the envelope, she had no idea that what lay inside would soon rewrite the final chapter of a story the town had nearly forgotten. In early 2017, the Twin Falls County Sheriff's Office was quieter than it had been in years, until the cold case team moved in. They set up in a small back office, lined with aging metal file cabinets and dusty boxes stacked to the ceiling. Their goal was simple but daunting: re-examine every major unsolved case before 1990. At the top of that list was Linda Rayburn, missing since 1975. The file was thin, no more than an inch thick, a few grainy photographs, a list of witness interviews, and Detective Harold Decker's final report. The new team's leader, Detective Laura Mitchell, was 39, too young to remember the original case, but she'd grown up in Twin Falls hearing whispers of the girl by the canyon. When she opened the file, she found a single Polaroid of Linda taped to the inside cover. The photo had yellowed with age, but her expression, soft eyes, half smile, felt heartbreakingly alive. Mitchell began by cataloging every piece of evidence. Most of it was useless after 4 decades. The sandwich wrapper, the purse, the seat cover fibers. But inside a sealed plastic tube marked Vehicle Door Swab, 10-10-75, she found the faint trace of what looked like dried residue. The handwriting beside it, shaky but precise, read, "Collected by H. Decker." When forensic analyst Dr. Kate Morrell examined the swab under magnification, she was stunned. Against all odds, a small amount of cellular material had survived. Too little for traditional testing, but potentially enough for modern touch DNA analysis. It was a long shot, but it was worth trying. The sample was carefully extracted and sent to the Idaho State Police Forensic Laboratory in Meridian. Weeks passed before the results came back. The DNA profile was incomplete, degraded, partial, but it was something. When the lab uploaded it into the Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, the system returned no direct match. Not surprising. Whoever had been responsible likely hadn't been convicted of a serious crime. But the team wasn't done. Around that time, the FBI had begun collaborating with agencies across the country using genetic genealogy, a process that compared crime scene DNA to publicly available genealogy databases. Though controversial, the method had already cracked cold cases from the 1980s and 1990s. In 2019, the Twin Falls team decided to try it. Dr. Morrell sent the extracted DNA to a specialized lab in Virginia. It took nearly 8 months to get results. 8 months of waiting, hoping. Then in early 2020 the call came. The analysis had identified a cluster of distant relatives, mostly in southern Idaho and eastern Oregon, all linked to one family name, Vickers. Detective Mitchell began digging through records. The Vickers family had been long-time residents of the area, scattered across small farms and ranches near Jerome. Among them was one name that stood out, Charles Chuck Vickers, a man who in 1975 had been 26 and working as a mechanic at a local garage less than a mile from Miller's Diner. Mitchell pulled his old employment record and mugshot. Vickers had been questioned once, briefly, in the original investigation, after a co-worker mentioned he often hung around the diner after hours. But he'd provided an alibi. He claimed he'd been home fixing his truck the night Linda disappeared, and the police had moved on. It didn't help that he'd left town the following year, relocating to Oregon. He'd never been charged with anything serious, just minor theft and assault, and his name eventually faded from local memory. But his age, location, and connection to the diner made him impossible to ignore. When Mitchell checked further, she discovered something chilling. Charles Vickers had died in 2012 in a small town near Salem, Oregon. He'd never faced justice, never even been considered a prime suspect. Still, DNA doesn't lie. The team obtained a court order to exhume Vickers' remains. In July 2020, under the supervision of Idaho and Oregon authorities, forensic specialists collected bone and hair samples for comparison. The wait for results was excruciating. Another 6 months of silence. On January 14, 2021, the final report came through. The mitochondrial DNA from Vickers' remains matched the partial profile found on Linda's car, with a probability of 1 in 11 trillion. After 46 years, the identity of Linda Rayburn's killer was confirmed. The news spread through Twin Falls like wildfire. Reporters camped outside the sheriff's office. Radio stations replayed old interviews from 1975, and television anchors called it one of the oldest solved murders in Idaho history. But for Linda's surviving family, it wasn't about headlines. Her younger brother, Danny Rayburn, was 70 by then, retired from a construction job in Boise. When he got the call, he sat in silence for a long time, staring at the wall. Then he whispered, "I knew she'd never just left." The sheriff's office held a press conference 2 days later. Standing before a wall of cameras, Detective Mitchell read from her prepared notes, her voice steady but emotional. "This case has haunted Twin Falls for nearly half a century, thanks to persistence, modern science, and the memory of one family who never stopped believing. We can finally say Linda's name with an answer, not a question." Behind her, an enlarged photo of Linda smiled out from a display board, her image clearer than ever. For the Rayburn family, the news was a strange mix of relief and grief. The answers they'd wanted had come, but too late for those who'd waited longest. Carl and Mabel had both passed away in the 1990s, never knowing the truth. Danny visited their graves the next morning and left a note that simply said, "We found her." It's over now, but the story didn't end there. Because as investigators began re-examining old files connected to Charles Vickers, they discovered that Linda might not have been his only victim. When investigators confirmed that Charles Chuck Vickers was responsible for Linda Rayburn's death, they weren't ready to close the file. They wanted to know why. Vickers had left behind a trail of small crimes that, at the time, had seemed unrelated. Trespassing, bar fights, stolen vehicles, coal miner, all scattered across southern Idaho and Oregon during the 1970s and 80s. But as Detective Laura Mitchell and her team began digging through old records, a pattern began to form. Between 1974 and 1978, 3 young women had vanished from small towns along U.S. Route 93, a corridor that ran directly through Twin Falls County. None of those cases were ever solved. The women all fit a similar profile. Mid-20s, dark hair, lived alone or worked late shifts. Two were last seen near diners or service stations. Back in the 1970s, local jurisdictions rarely communicated. Cases that crossed county lines often stayed disconnected. But when Mitchell compared the dates and locations to Vickers' known work history, every one of those disappearances matched a period when he'd been employed nearby. Then came the breakthrough, a 1977 police report from Gooding County, just 40 miles northwest of Twin Falls. It described an incident involving a Charles Fees, who had been questioned after a waitress claimed he followed her home from work. The woman reported that he'd offered her a ride, then became aggressive when she refused. She managed to get away and no charges were filed. His name had been misspelled in the report, Vickers instead of Vickers, which was why no one had connected it until now. As Mitchell read that file aloud in the evidence room, the team went silent. For the first time they saw the bigger picture, not a random act of violence, but a pattern of predation hidden in plain sight. Still, no one could say exactly what had happened to Linda on that October night in 1975. Through forensic reanalysis, investigators examined microscopic fibers found in her car's upholstery. Modern testing identified two distinct materials. One matched the interior of her Chevy Nova, and the other, a coarse tan fiber, matched the upholstery of a 1972 Ford F-100 pickup truck. Vickers had owned one. That small discovery allowed them to reconstruct a likely sequence of events. After leaving Miller's diner that night, Linda likely got into her car intending to head home. Vickers, who knew her from the garage, may have followed her, possibly to help with a minor car issue he'd fabricated earlier that week. When she pulled over on Shoshone Falls Road, he probably offered assistance, or asked her to step out for a moment. Investigators believed the encounter turned violent near the turnout. The swabbed DNA on her driver's door suggested a struggle, his hand gripping the handle while she tried to close it. He overpowered her, forced her into his truck, and drove toward one of the many remote trails near the canyon. What happened next could only be pieced together through deduction. The area near the Snake River was vast, rugged, and largely unmonitored in 1975. Search teams had scoured much of it, but if her body had been placed in the river's deeper channels, it would have been carried miles downstream. Years later, in 2022, a new search effort, using ground-penetrating radar and sonar mapping, focused on several potential disposal sites near a now-abandoned farm Vickers once rented. There, beneath layers of compacted soil, forensic teams uncovered human bone fragments, consistent with a female in her early 20s. DNA testing confirmed what everyone already knew in their hearts. It was Linda. Nearly 50 years after her disappearance, she had finally been found. The discovery brought a wave of emotion that spread across Idaho. Reporters gathered again at the canyon overlook as police cars lined the dirt road where the original search had begun decades earlier. For the Rayburn family, the moment was both sacred and surreal. When detectives handed them a small box containing Linda's recovered remains, her brother Danny couldn't speak. He just nodded, clutching it like something fragile and holy. "She's coming home," he said quietly. The funeral took place on a calm spring morning in May 2022. The church pews were full, some attendees old enough to remember the original search, others too young to have lived it, but raised hearing her story. A framed photograph of Linda, the same one from the diner bulletin board in 1975, stood beside the pulpit. Detective Mitchell spoke briefly during the service. "For every case that goes cold," she said, "there's a family that keeps the fire alive." The Rayburns did that for nearly 5 decades. And because of them, because they never gave up, we were finally able to bring her home. As the organ played softly, Danny stepped forward to place his sister's photograph atop the casket. He rested his hand on the wood and whispered, "Mom and Dad can rest now." Outside, the air smelled faintly of rain. The hills beyond the cemetery were green from spring growth. It felt for the first time in a long time like peace. In the weeks after the burial, the sheriff's office held a final press briefing. They officially closed the case of State of Idaho versus Charles E. Vickers, confirming him as the killer. The district attorney publicly thanked the cold case team, the forensic labs, and the persistence of a family that never lost faith. But for Detective Mitchell, the work didn't end there. The remaining missing persons cases along Route 93 were reopened for comparison. Although no further DNA links were confirmed, the team believed Vickers may have been responsible for at least 2 other disappearances that predated Linda's. They would never know for sure. Too much time had passed, too much evidence lost. Still, for the first time in nearly 50 years, Twin Falls had its answer. The mystery that had haunted the town for generations was no longer a question whispered at the edge of conversation. It was history, finally written with clarity, with truth. But even as the official file was marked closed, something lingered. The feeling that Linda's story had changed more than just one family's life. It had reshaped an entire community's understanding of justice and of time itself. In the months following the funeral, Twin Falls felt different, quieter, the kind of quiet that comes not from absence but from understanding. For nearly half a century, the story of Linda Rayburn had hovered like unfinished music over the town, a song without an ending. Now at last, the final note had been struck. The Twin Falls County Sheriff's Office created a small memorial wall in their headquarters. It displayed the names and photographs of Idaho's oldest solved cold cases, and at the very top, framed in silver, was Linda's. Beneath her photograph was a line engraved in brass. "Justice may rest, but it never sleeps." Detective Laura Mitchell would pass that wall every morning. Some days she'd pause just for a moment and think of the young woman in that diner uniform, walking toward her car under a 1975 sky. In her own quiet way, Mitchell had made peace with the case, but it had changed her forever. In interviews, she spoke less about forensics and more about people. "Cold cases aren't just files," she said. "They're unfinished stories. And when we reopen them, we're not just chasing evidence, we're giving someone back their name." That message resonated beyond Twin Falls. Other departments across Idaho adopted similar cold case initiatives. Families from neighboring counties called in to ask whether their loved ones' cases might also be reopened. One by one, new boxes came off old shelves. New hands began sorting through the dust of forgotten tragedies. For the Rayburn family, closure didn't come in a single moment. It came slowly, like dawn after a long winter. Danny, now gray-haired and soft-spoken, found comfort in visiting the canyon overlook, where his sister's car had been found. He would bring flowers once a year, set them by the guardrail, and stay until the sun went down. "I used to come here and ask why," he told a reporter in 2023. "Now I just say thank you." His daughter, Emily, named after the aunt she never met, helped establish the Linda Rayburn Foundation, a small non-profit that supports forensic testing for unsolved cases across Idaho. They raised funds for DNA, reanalysis, and sponsored an annual scholarship for young women studying forensic science at Boise State University. The foundation's motto was simple: every case deserves an ending. By 2024, the Rayburn case had become a touchstone in discussions of cold case reform. True crime documentaries featured it as an example of perseverance and technological progress. But for those who had lived through it, the story wasn't about the science, it was about memory. One local pastor said it best during a community vigil that spring. "In the end, what we remember about Linda isn't how she died, but how her story refused to be buried." The vigil was held at Shoshone Falls, overlooking the same canyon where the search began 50 years earlier. The crowd stood silently as white